Good morning. I always enjoy coming here to speak and to worship with you. I was telling Deb this morning that just looking downstairs reminded me of when my girls were here. Some of you may remember that my husband and I were witness workers. We were missionaries in China for many years. And we came to speak here several times when our girls were little. We had come back from China, and we would go church to church speaking. And I just remember time after the potluck, and we were trying to do a presentation, and my girls were rolling around on the floor. And so if you remember that too, I'm sorry. I no longer live in China, as was mentioned. I'm living in Rostern, and I am working with the International Program for Mennonite Church Canada. And so this morning, I want to also bring you greetings from your national family of faith, Mennonite Church Canada. You know, today we are worshiping here in Carrot River, and we're also worshiping across Canada in 5 regions, more than 200 congregations in over 20 languages. It's a strong and diverse family. And I'm excited as I visit many parts of this family to see that God is moving and working in the lives of congregations like yours in so many places across Canada. And so I also want to take the opportunity to let you know about a week and a half from now, we'll be gathering as a national family of faith in Kitchener. And I invite you to pray for this gathering. And as people gather to see what God is doing across the country, and then to discern together what God is asking us to be and to do in this time and place. If you're not attending the conference in Kitchener, there will be live stream of several of the sessions, and I don't have the link right now, but I'll send it to Pastor Kevin when I find out the link so that you can also attend parts of the gathering. I think you might be excited about what you hear from people there and their desire to follow Jesus with their whole lives. The theme is how every gift of every person is important in the journey that we have together. God's Spirit is moving in God's church. Our national family of faith is strengthened by the gifts that we receive from our global companions. And I have the honor, privilege, blessing of being able to work with these global companions in about 15 different countries in the world through the International Witness Program. And then through Mennonite World Conference, we see ourselves part of a larger global Anabaptist movement that covers about 86 countries with 10,000 congregations. You know that more than 2/3 of Mennonites in the world come from outside of Europe and North America. And so when we celebrate this year the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism, we look to the future of this movement. God is doing something new. And just like God drew new expressions of faith from the roots of the European church 500 years ago, God is drawing something new from the roots today as the global family of faith expands in places that we've never heard of. Today I want to look at how we see ourselves within that global community of faith and what that relationship can be as we seek to follow Jesus moving forward. Please join me in prayer. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be pleasing to your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. If I was a little wiser, I wouldn't take on the book of Ruth in one sermon. I was thinking about it because at the Rostern Mennonite Church where I worship, we are looking this summer at going through women in the Bible for each Sunday. And so I was looking at this story of Ruth and some of the themes in it, and I thought, oh, this would be a great sermon. But then as I really got into planning, I realized, oh, this book is so rich in content and in symbolism, in themes. This should be like a course or a series, not one single sermon. So you'll get my synopsis of this today. And I think that those of us who've grown up in rural Saskatchewan might get some things out of this text that other people don't. That was certainly the case last year in rural northeastern Thailand. Right in that area of Thailand, Mennonite Church Canada has witness workers, Tom and Christine Puvong. And they hosted an Old Testament professor, Derek Suderman from Conrad Grable in Ontario, and he presented the gospel through the story of Ruth. The gospel of Jesus through the story of Ruth. And talking about Ruth and Naomi and Boaz and the people there got so excited to see the gospel portrayed through a rural village that looked so much like their own in Thailand. They could relate, and they could relate in a deeper way than the professor from Conrad Grable, because his roots were not rural like theirs. They knew this story because they had lived it. And so today I can't get into that kind of depth. But I do want to narrow it down to look at one part of this story, and that's the relationship between Ruth and Naomi, and the description of that relationship that was used by several characters in the book. I love that Ruth and Naomi were outsiders for most of their lives, and I guess I can relate to that in some ways. When our children were in primary school in China, they used to have fun with the process of registering at the police station. Because in China, all foreigners have to register every year at the police station to get a resident permit. So our girls would spend the time, and sometimes it was a long process, they spent the time speculating on what form of aliens we were and how we took on human form as a disguise, because the police officer was working on the form, and right at the top it said that we were resident aliens. So our girls thought this was hilarious. Oh, what kind of aliens are we? What's our real form? Here we are in human form. I always suspected that the process went a little quicker for our family because the police officer couldn't wait to get us out of there. Naomi had fled famine with her young family and lived in Moab. And now, with her husband and her sons gone, she was returning home in defeat, as it were. Except she wasn't alone. Ruth went with her. What a feisty daughter-in-law. There was no way she was leaving Naomi. Even though Naomi sent her back, how many times? 2, 3 times she tried to send her back, but she wouldn't go. She would not let Naomi go on that long, it was probably a 7 to 10 day walking journey through dangers unknown. Now this was the time of the judges, where people, the phrase that's used in the Bible is, did what was right in their own eyes. And when that phrase is used in the Bible, it never means peace and stability. It always means a time of danger and chaos. Ruth will do whatever it takes to be Naomi's companion, to go where she will go, to believe in her God, to die with her, even saying that death won't separate them. What had Ruth and Naomi been through for her to be so committed? This was no ordinary mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship. So they faced this journey together. And facing life as a widow in those days was very daunting. It is today as well. But there were other implications. Widows were almost not human. Their property, their wealth, their position in society was all gone with the death of their husbands. They were a forgotten and marginalized group. Many turned to prostitution in this situation for some kind of financial security. Naomi saw Ruth's only hope was returning to her family and trying to find someone else to marry. I was recently talking with a Hmong Canadian, and that's a group that you might recognize from Vietnam, Thailand, Laos area, the Hmong people. And this is, she was from Ontario, Hmong Canadian, and their congregation in Ontario was recently in touch with several churches in the mountains and the border between Thailand and Laos. And they are small congregations. One of them has about 11 families, and she said, quite a few widows. And I wondered why she had chosen that part of the congregation to single out. And she said that in the traditional Hmong culture of that area, women who were widowed were usually shunned by the community. People didn't want to associate with them for several reasons. They were bad luck. Also, they might get sick and need care and money, or they might die and they wouldn't have any family to bury them. That's a real fear in that culture. But this congregation up in the mountains, though they're quite isolated from other Christians, they instinctively took in these widows and made them part of the community. They probably understand this story of Naomi at a deeper level than we do. The desperation, the fear of going back to your hometown with the risk of rejection. This would have been really very real to the women in this congregation in Thailand. Now, Ruth lived in a culture where young women were supposed to commit their lives to men and live as helpful dependents. But Ruth commits her life to an elderly woman who has no access to resources and power. She chooses caring for her mother-in-law over other potential opportunities. It makes me wonder where we are choosing companions for our journey. Do we choose to walk with people who have power and resources for us, or do we choose to walk with the least of these, as Jesus taught us? Now, there's a radical statement made in this story, and this is something that I have to admit in my reading of Ruth, because I do not know Hebrew, big surprise, I had never figured out before. But as I was studying, I came upon this word chesed. I think it's supposed to be said with a real guttural sort of, but I'm not going to do that. Chesed. There's a radical statement made in this story. Ruth is described as showing chesed to Naomi. Now, why is that so radical? First of all, what is chesed? You might have had a clue from the great readings that Marvin chose this morning. Chesed is one of those Hebrew words that's kind of hard to translate. It needs a lot of English words to translate, but it includes love, mercy, faithfulness, steadfast love, loving kindness. It's a word that's used often in the Psalms. It was a common word in worship to God. So this is a word suddenly here in the book of Ruth that's being used to describe what Ruth represented to Naomi. Ruth was chesed for Naomi. Naomi went from the bitter one to someone who struggled to survive and hoped again that life could change. Ruth transformed through the power of chesed Naomi's life by caring for her, by committing to her. This is a description of how God works in the world, in and through those that God created, because chesed is God's true character. And God's true character is revealed by God's creation, including the creation of humans. And that's why it's such a radical statement in this book, because who is showing chesed? It's a foreigner and a woman, the least of these. And not only a foreigner, but maybe even an enemy was showing the character of God. God's character is revealed through the covenant, through the companionship, through the act of loving kindness, of walking together, despite divisions of class or ethnicity or race. Now, we sing the song, "They will know we are Christians by our love," but sometimes I wonder if we really show that we love across these borders. Do we show that special thing that God's love crosses borders? Jesus taught us about this different kind of love, this loving your enemies type of love. As I was driving here today and listening to the news of the bombings that happened last night and of the increasing violence in our world, my heart just cried out for this kind of chesed, this kind of loving your enemies kind of love. And if the church in the world really showed this love, what kind of power would that be? That's a power beyond bombs. It's a power that I think we have yet to see. Now, a woman of Moab showing the chesed of God in her daily life. Moab was a continuous threat to Judah. It was an economic powerhouse. It was proud. It was always ready to compete with Judah and to take over the threat to take over the promised land. And yet here was a woman of Moab showing chesed. Maybe Ruth didn't set out to perform acts of kindness. She was trying to survive, just like Naomi. She was just living her life, but she had been transformed by the love of God in Naomi's God. And so her decisions and actions were powerfully transformative to Naomi and then to Boaz, who responded to the loving kindness that she showed. Now, in this journey from Moab to Judah, Naomi had a companion who was the heart of God to her. But this companion was a foreigner. Now, as I thought about that, and with my background and my work in the global church, I had to think about a quote that I've heard from John Roth. John Roth is a former history professor at Goshen College, and he had taken on this 500 Anabaptism at 500 initiative from Menomedia. And a few years ago, he was asked, "Why are you volunteering all the time with Mennonite World Conference?" And he answered, and I quote him here. He said, "In part, because I'm convinced the renewal and the new life in the church that I love and that I grew up in will only happen to the extent that we are attentive to what is happening in the global church." We hear God's voice in places where we walk together, where we have companions on a journey. And I'd like to tell you a few stories about those companions on our journey that don't live in Saskatchewan, that don't live in Canada, but that also have a message of God's chesed for us. Doug Clausen, my boss, is the executive minister of Mennonite Church Canada. And he was visiting one of these companions a few years ago in Ethiopia. The Mesorita Christos Church is the largest and fastest growing Mennonite church in the world. And I'm going to read you exactly what Doug wrote about his experience there. Doug writes this: "We had just finished worshiping with the Mennonite church in Adama, Ethiopia. The building was packed to the rafters, and there were no cars allowed in the small parking lot because there were benches set up and a loudspeaker with an overflow crowd. There were at least 500 people there, the majority under the age of 40. After the service, they wanted to show us the elementary school that they run. Of the 600 students enrolled, 100 of them attend for free because they can't afford to pay. There are no street children begging in the city of Adama, because any child that is found begging on the street will be taken in by a Mennonite family who will try to help them find their parents, and if they cannot, they will take them into their own homes and raise them with their own children. As we were driving to the school and then to the hospital established in 1945 by the first Mennonite missionaries to arrive there, an elderly man kept trying to sit beside me in the van. I couldn't figure out what was going on until he said, "I want to tell you something. I didn't have a good childhood. My life was in peril. I took a chance and came to this hospital that the Mennonites started here, and I asked them for a job, and they hired me to be an orderly." "That's great," I said. "I'm not finished. You see this building here? Every day the Mennonites would go in there together for a time. We asked them what they were doing in there, and they answered they were worshiping God. We said, 'Oh, you're worshiping God so you won't get sick.' And they answered, 'No.' They came together to tell each other what they had seen God doing in their lives and in the lives of their patients, and they worship and give thanks to God for all of it. And then they pray for the many needs. We asked if we could join them, and they said yes." Then the elderly man went on to tell me breathtaking stories of how the peace of Jesus had completely transformed his life and the life of many other Ethiopians working alongside him. In the end, he asked me, "Do you know why I told you this?" I said, "I think you wanted to express gratitude." "No," he interrupted. "I want to tell you because I know that the church in North America is struggling. You are losing the vision for the gospel, and all I can say is, how dare you? How dare you keep this good news to yourself?" He said, "It's my choice whether or not I follow Jesus, but withholding the good news from others, the good news that can transform their lives, how dare you not tell others?" When Doug finished writing this and sharing it with me, he said, "I'll never forget this experience." Today, when I heard Andrew's song about Unashamed, it reminded me of this story. I think this elderly gentleman from Ethiopia would have said a loud amen at the end of your song. 2 months ago, leaders within Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Mission Network, which is sort of the International Witness counterpart in the US, they were invited to an online prayer vigil by the Semilla Latin America Anabaptist Seminary in Guatemala. The seminary leaders in Guatemala had already sent a prayer request out to Mennonite World Conference for their family of faith in the US. They wanted the world to pray, but they also wanted to invite the leaders of the US Mennonite churches to this prayer vigil online to show that they cared about them in a difficult time that Americans are facing. Now think about this. A couple months ago was the same time when people from Latin America were being put on planes, kicked out of the US, but these brothers and sisters from Guatemala wanted to show their love for the people of the US by praying with them and for them. It challenged me. It seems a little bit more like they were showing chesed when my response was elbows up. These people were showing chesed to their brothers and sisters in the US. Jonathan Neufeld is the Indigenous Relations Coordinator for Mennonite Church Canada, and last fall he visited some northern Indigenous communities in Manitoba. Like Doug in the previous story, he also had some older people kept trying to stand beside him at the event he was attending. And finally, one of them said, "You're one of those Mennonites." And Jonathan said, "Yeah." And they said, "Where did you go? You used to hang out here. You used to have people living in our community. Where have you been for the last 20 years? They were seeking companionship on their journey, but our fears were keeping us away. Last fall, I traveled through several provinces in Canada with 3 Chinese pastors. One was the president of an underground seminary in China. His doctorate is in mission history. And as he heard from people across Canada and heard a bit about the history of Mennonite Church Canada, he said to me one day, "In the history of the modern mission era, the church has always moved from the wealthy, powerful nations to those that are less wealthy and less powerful. And that's why we've had the problem of colonialism interacting with mission, because the gospel always came from a position of power." And he said, when nations begin to become more equal in power and financial influence, mission tends to stop. He said, they are seeing that now in China in a major way. As China rises in economic and political power in competition with North America, it sounds a little bit like Moab and Judah, doesn't it? Financial, economic, political rivals, enemies. But this a seminary professor from China said, his message for us was, don't use this as an excuse to close yourselves off from the global church by saying maybe that we did it wrong or maybe they don't need us anymore. He said we do need each other. God speaks to us with a special blessing when we see God in each other across the cultures, across the races, across political borders. China might be the enemy right now for us in Canada, but God's Spirit is moving in the midst of people there, and they want us to be involved. They want us to continue to support. They want us to pray and to build God's kingdom together with them in China. He said, this is not the time to back away. These are the messages when we look for God in the enemy, in the foreigner. These are the message that Ruth brought to Judah, the message of chesed, loving kindness across borders. So back to our story about Ruth, and I love that someone put these fun facts in here because it will back up what I had to say. There they are. There's Ruth in the lineage of David. There was Ruth and Boaz, the blessing of God to Israel through David's greater son, Jesus, a blessing to the whole world. And the improbable catalyst for all of this is Ruth, a widow, a foreigner, just trying to survive, but acting out the transformation of God's love in her life. God's covenant of love, chesed, lived out in the lives of everyday, ordinary human beings who are on a journey together. And what a journey it is. Amen.